Welcome back to the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski. I don't know about you, but I want to live my greatest life in a lean, healthy, and muscular body. If that sounds exciting to you, or if that sounds like it's in alignment with your goals, you're going to love this podcast. So over the last 5 years, I've been the one preaching train well, train intelligently, and at the same time, understand all of the external variables that go into allowing you to go into the gym and perform at your best. So most people who are coaches out there tend to focus on one or two things myopically and say, hey, this is the most important. And sometimes a nutritionist will say, hey, nutrition is the most important. And sometimes a trainer will say training is the most important. But the reality is, which one is most important to you right now can be different based on person to person and month to month. Year to year, it changes based on your limiting factors. Today's guest is a previous guest who I am so excited to welcome back, Joel Jamieson. Joel has just launched a new course called Recover to Win. Everything that goes into recovery, and we're going to dive into it today. So we talk about things like heart rate variability, which you've heard me talk about before. We talk about sleep. We talk about how to match training and nutrition to optimize performance and recovery and recoverability. We talk a little bit about stress management, mindset, and all of the other biohacking / modalities that go into optimizing recovery so you can perform and ultimately feel your best, whether it be in the gym or outside the gym. You're going to absolutely love this podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by grass-fed liver and bone marrow by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements makes New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, liver, and bone marrow in a simple and convenient gelatin capsule. Getting in organ meats is an imperative part of optimized health and performance, especially if you eat a lot of muscle meat. Typically in our culture, organ meats are not something that is a prized part of our nutrition. However, we know that organ meats provide incredibly bioavailable sources of vitamin A, choline, folate, B12, copper, iron, and fat-soluble activators that are absent in the modern diet. This is nourishment that is known to support methylation and ultimately fundamental health. And I highly suggest that every one of my clients and every one of my listeners consume some type of organ meat. And I love Ancestral, and I've been using them for a while now because they actually provide it in really simple to consume varieties of organ meats. I typically consume liver, I consume kidney, and sometimes I consume a blend of all of the organ meats, and allows me to get it in a simple and easy to consume way that ultimately allows me to not have to cook organ meats. And I do sometimes cook organ meats because, Belcampo is also an incredible sponsor of this podcast, but Ancestral is a brand new sponsor of the podcast. So we want to support Ancestral and ultimately support your health. Thank you so much to Ancestral for being a part of the Muscle Intelligence community in supporting our journey to live a great life in a body that we absolutely love so we can be lean, healthy, and muscular for life. Go to ancestralsupplements.com and use the code BEN to get 10% off. And this discount also applies on US Amazon, which is awesome. Thank you so much. Enjoy the podcast. And we are live with Joel Jamieson. What's up, my man?
Not much. How you doing? Good to talk to you again.
You're so great. So great to have you show us Morpheus, your new tech that is launching to help coaches integrate all the data from all these wearables and ultimately have a platform to understand it. We can get into that a little bit. And you've also launched a course, Recover to Win. I'm super excited to hear all about that. Let's just jump into the course, man. So tell us why you created it. Everyone knows you from the podcast in the past, having talked about heart rate variability, recoverability, energy systems. So why is Recover to Win your newest baby?
Yeah, it's something I've been working on for a long time just because I saw such a need for coaches to extend their coaching beyond the walls of the gym. I think we've spent a lot of time learning sets and reps and exercises and methods, and those things have been covered, millions of times, and lots of people talk about it. But the reality is if you're not coaching some of the other big pieces, if you're not coaching people to improve their sleep, if you're not coaching them to understand the big picture of recovery, if you're not looking about, activity and regeneration strategies, all those pieces matter in terms of helping people improve their fitness and achieve their goals. And the education just hasn't been there for the coaches or for the clients themselves. There just hasn't been an organized, structured way to approach recovery in a way that's meaningful and valuable. So I built it to serve that need, to serve that purpose, and to help people understand, how do I help someone improve their sleep from a coach? Or if I'm a client, how do I go about improving my sleep? How do I know how active I should be? How many steps a day are right for me? Is 10,000 right? Or is that just a made up number? How does nutrition play a role in recovery? So I really just want to help people understand the big picture of these questions. And so Recover to Win was my answer to that.
So walk through like high level overview of the course, and you mentioned something like recoverability. Heart rate variability is obviously a thing, but is it effectively just walking through strategies, kind of silo by silo, whether it be nutrition or recovery strategies to help people improve recoverability for performance?
Yeah, so I have 5 big pieces of Recover to Win. So I have move, train, eat, sleep, and regenerate, and those are really the 5 big pillars of recovery in my mind, because those are the 5 things that drive it. So build Recover to Win to go through each one of those pillars. Movement, how active should I be? Is the right amount of steps for me 10,000, 20,000, 5,000? Like, how many steps should I be going? Training, what sort of intensities are appropriate? How do I manage those intensities based on my recovery? Sleeping, how does my sleep affect my recovery? How do I improve my sleep? What defines good sleep? Nutrition, what do I eat? How do I eat it? How do those things play a role? And then regeneration. So I walk through each of those pillars so people understand how they work, how to improve them, how to assess them, how to evaluate whether or not you have a problem in that area. And then the last module is building a recovery roadmap. And so that's really the process of figuring out what it is that I need to improve the most in my recovery, in my lifestyle, to get better fitness. And so I attack it the same way as training. I don't just say, oh, we're going to improve every area of fitness at once. I figure out, okay, well, here's the area of fitness that I think is going to help you the most get to where you want to go. And it's the same thing with recovery. And I really want to help people look at recovery from that standpoint of a plan, a strategy, versus just a bunch of things that you do. And so the idea is that I want to develop this process where I evaluate my recovery in these different areas of my lifestyle. I figure out where are my biggest limitations, whether that's nutritional or sleep or the training side or whatever the case may be. And then I come up with an actual plan to address it and to fix it, to improve my sleep or to improve my nutrition or to manage my intensity more effectively or to get better at managing mental stress. And then you track it. You use the data, use the technology to see and make sure that you are achieving those positive changes and it is having the impact that you want it to have. So, again, people think about building a training program. They think about exercises and sets and reps, and they have a goal and they work towards and they see if they're improving. But recovery has gotten more attention recently, but it's always been like, go try cryo or go get a massage or try these supplements. Like, not that they're bad, but it needs to be more of a framework. It needs to have more context and more of a system behind it. And then that's really the way I've approached recovery, is just that same process of training, but on the recovery side and attacking weak links and minimizing things that are keeping you from reaching your goals. And that's the framework that I built it on.
Yeah, it's effectively throw shit at the wall and see what sticks, right? And
yeah, and hope something works, right?
Right.
I mean,
yeah. And as far as your approach, that's exactly what I do. It's like, what's the elephant in the room? What's the big glaring weakness in your armor? And let's make that better first. And then I say, like, pull that lever first, and people will notice such a drastic improvement in their ability to recover and perform, that it's just, it's almost like a no-brainer. And no coaches really take that approach, it seems. And I'm glad that you're doing this because, people are always trying to scale volume and they're trying to scale intensity and they're trying to scale workload and work capacity without, kind of concurrently scaling recovery modalities as well. And nobody's emphasizing that as maybe the greatest opportunity to progress.
It is. Why we don't have to go down this whole rabbit hole, but why do people use performance enhancing drugs? They use them to scale recovery. That's literally what the drugs primarily allow you to create a bigger training effect through greater stress, and then they facilitate much greater recovery. I've seen people use drugs and their HRV goes through the roof because their body's just highly anabolic and it's highly in this recovery state all the time. So obviously we can't have the exact same effects, but it's just this principle. People need to understand that scaling up recovery does, in most cases, scale up results. It's just as important as scaling up intensity. And to your point, you can't scale up intensity without also scaling up recovery, because intensity causes the need for more recovery. So if you don't do anything to address it, you just get this yo-yo system that people go through of, I see some results, I stop seeing results. I do more intensity, I see a little more results. I scale up intensity, and sooner or later, I hit a plateau and maybe I get injured. So it's just this recurring cycle that people need to break. And the way you break it is by matching the gains of intensity and volume with improvements in your recovery at the same time.
Yeah, that's one of the things I teach my coaches is like, what are all the levers you could possibly pull to improve recovery? Just list them, like put them all on a piece of paper and go, okay, well, which ones for that particular client are feasible, are useful, and are likely to be retained over time or adhered to over time.
Yep.
And that in and of itself is the foundation of it all. So it's just listing them in this high level way and go, okay, which one of these seems like it'll actually move the needle the most for this particular person. So let's go through movement, Joel, and how you start, kind of maybe qualifying movement before you quantify it, right? Because
Sure.
20,000 steps, walking around the house while going to the fridge is not the same as 20,000 steps out climbing a mountain. So, is there a way that you suggest people kind of conceptualize movement in general?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two pieces to it. We can look just overall movement quality, which is its own animal, right? You can evaluate how well people are moving. If they have big limitations that are going to cause more stress, they repeat them over 1,000 times a day, right? And then you can look at just the overall amount. And a lot of it, to be honest, it comes down to just energy. It literally just kind of comes down to the amount of calories you expend in a day.
Yep.
And of course, climbing a mountain is going to be different than walking, but at the same point in time, you're going to burn a whole lot more calories climbing a mountain, and that's going to differentiate walking aside from the intensity level. So we just have to understand that the metabolism can only create so much energy in a day, and the biggest piece of that is just our activity. And if we do go 20,000 steps up a mountain, that's going to burn a tremendous amount of energy. And then the question is there enough left over for the recovery piece? So we just have to understand how many total calories should we be targeting in a day to burn, and that generally will fall into a step range, but it depends, like you said, on the activity. So the first thing I do is you can take about 2.5 times your basic metabolic rate. If you've ever had a metabolic test done, or you use what's called the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation, you can kind of use ways to estimate roughly where your metabolic ceiling is, and that's somewhere around 2.5 times that number. What that means is if I consistently exceed that number of calories expended in a day, chances are I'm not going to have enough left over for recovery, because my metabolism can't create more than that on average. So if my resting metabolic rate, like let's say it takes me roughly 1,000 calories to just stay alive, about 2,500 calories a day is what I'm going to be able to burn consistently or produce consistently on a daily basis. If I start going over that consistently, I'm going to start to see negative things happen. So you do take intensity into account, obviously, but that's, intensity also will drive higher calories anyway. So, I start there, just understand the big picture of energy production, metabolism, and I figure out what someone's metabolic ceiling is, and I use that as a guideline to help them understand how much activity is or is not appropriate on a given day. And then beyond that, you look at the quality side as well.
So there's kind of two sides of this coin that I want to approach. Is like there's the performance side and there's the fat loss side. And you said, if I can only produce 2.5 times my basal metabolic rate and energy per day, would that be an appropriate level for someone who's trying to lose fat to actually start to try to hit, right? Like, do I want to be slightly over that 2.5 times a day to allow myself to know that there's no way that I'm not going to burn fat, or is that simply too much? I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously you have to create caloric deficit. There's two ways to do it, right? You eat less or you move more, and probably some combination thereof. So you can definitely increase activity and obviously burn more fat up to a point, but then it kind of comes back to the calorie equation too. So you can do it both ways, and both have their pluses and minuses. If you're super highly active and you are going consistently above that threshold, then you are going to have a greater impact on your recovery than if you stay around that threshold and just create the deficit through nutritional deficit. So I think it depends on the level of body fat loss you're talking about. You can definitely exceed that for a while, but then I think you do want to come back down that number as well too. So if you do consistently exceed that number by a large amount, that's where we do see the research showing immune system compromise. You see your loss of sex drive. You see all the negative things that we see when the deficit's too big. Basically, it doesn't matter what your deficit is if that's going to be end result. So you have to be just mindful of that number. And I think you can exceed it for times, but I wouldn't have anybody say, go 3 times your basic metabolic rate to maximize fat loss. But I think you're going to have a cost of diminishing return there.
Do you think that, so you say 2.5 times is your body's maximum ability to produce energy. Do you think that would be then the ceiling of calories we should be inputting without going over to, because obviously if we're going over the amount our body can produce, it's maybe likely to be stored as fat. I'm curious what your thought is there.
Yeah, so it's basically that it's not that we can't ever do that. So we can't do that over long periods of time, over time. So you can definitely exceed that number you go run a marathon, you're burning more than that, or you go climb a mountain, you are burning more than that. It's been shown essentially that over the course of days, weeks, and months, you can't exceed that consistently. Like your body kind of always adapts back to that number in terms of how many calories you can produce. And the interesting thing is the reason that it does that, they think, and this is some research out of where they went down and measured a lot of the African hunter-gatherer tribes. They measure different endurance events. They just kind of looked at what are our bodies capable in terms of metabolism, because the reality is it takes time to turn that apple into calories, and it takes energy to turn the apple into calories. It takes energy to make energy. And so there's just limitations in how fast that can happen and how much you can do in that 24-hour period on average over time. And so if you start to exceed that, and it doesn't really matter what your caloric intake is, you would ultimately just be burning down. You would be drawing down your fat stores and your glycogen stores. So they think that it's a metabolic ceiling because it's a hard stop for our body to be able to avoid eating itself, more or less. So the idea would be if I consistently burned 5 times my BMR, it wouldn't matter how much calories I ate. I would still be drawing down fat and muscle and ultimately glycogen and everything else. I'd be depleting myself into the ground if I could consistently burn more than that. So there's that kind of hard stop of around 2.5 times is what our body uses to protect itself in terms of making sure we can survive, and not just, you basically train yourself to death no matter how much you ate, is my point, if it didn't have that hard limit, right?
Yeah. So what would be the kind of core tenets you would teach a coach as far as establishing base level or performance level movement in someone?
So look, I think everyone kind of has their way of approaching movement screens. So there's lots of different paths, but you just want to make sure people have good movement competency and the core movements of pushing, pulling, lunging, squatting, rotating, those sorts of things. And then the biggest thing I would say is if you can't move well in some of these basic movement patterns, and then you do go 10, 15, 20,000 steps a day, you do work out, that's where you get just exacerbated levels of stress. Yeah. And you'll see that in HRV, right? You'll see somebody who generally moves pretty well, has good soft tissue quality, has just good movement capacity. They'll recover a whole lot faster than somebody who doesn't, because they're just placing more and more stress on themselves the more they move. So you want to develop those movement qualities in line with managing their overall movement activity level, so that you are, again, managing their overall level of stress. And I've seen that tons of times. Like if someone's squat pattern is really bad and you put them through a squat workout, they're going to be a lot worse off the next day than someone whose squat pattern was really good. So it's a moving target. It's the same thing. You always been working to improve them, because the worse your movement is, the more stress it is on your body, the slower your recovery becomes. It's that simple.
Man, you're the only person I've ever heard talk about that. And that's such an amazing thing that needs to just be driven home to people. It's like the value of high level movement quality and its ability to ultimately decrease the internal stress placed on the system. I think people don't conceptualize that. Most people just go to the gym and go, hey man, just bite down and work hard. And to me, that's just the stupidest thing in the world. Like, no, it's quality has to come before quantity, and people just don't see that. And you're literally the first person I've ever heard say that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it, right? So you have someone come, you have someone come in the gym and their movement sucks, and I'll look at their HRV the next day and I'll look at the big picture. You can see that level of workout, even though it wasn't maybe that higher intensity or volume, it just trashed them, because their body's so uncoordinated in those movement patterns. It creates so much stress and where it's not designed to be, that the body has to have so much more time devoted to the repair process, because it stressed a bunch of tissues that probably weren't designed for that stress. And so it just slows the entire thing down tremendously. Versus honestly, I think this is the big thing of, the first thing I'll say, I noticed this a long time ago. I went to the training camp with the Seahawks really early on, and I'd measure HRV and I'd watch them go out and train the first session, and I'd look at it again. Sometimes they'd look better. Like sometimes it literally, like that first morning session was almost like a recovery stimulated session than anything else, where somebody else would have just crushed them, because they have good work capacity and they're athletes, but their movement quality is so good. They're able to play 4 quarters in a game because they're able to be so efficient in their movement, and it's so much less stress on them than it would be on the average person. So I saw that really early on at like a high level athlete, just how much different they were than the non-athlete. It was just a stark contrast. People always say, what's the difference between high level athletes? Like their work capacity, their movement, their recoverability is just so high above the average person that they can tolerate, a season or a game in the way that the average person never could. And a lot of that just comes back to, I saw that over and over again. Really good quality movement led to much faster recovery. And then I just saw that same thing across the general population clients I would see, and the people that generally speaking had really bad movement quality. If you overload, that's the other thing is, if someone's got bad movement qualities and you overload them, you're just slowing their recovery down so much, right, that you're better off spending time improving the movement before you load them up more, because they're going to take 3-4 days to recover from something, versus their movement, can cut that down dramatically. So I just saw it, the data showed it to me.
That seems to be a massive role of strength and conditioning coaches and therapists in professional sports, is like, you don't necessarily have to make them better. Maybe you do, but you're making their movement quality better, right? So it's just like their primary focus is, how do we improve these foundational movements? How do we make sure they're moving well? Are they getting the right type of soft tissue work, the right mobility work, stability work, so that their body can do what it's meant to do? So it's this foundational stuff that I see pro athletes doing daily that the average gym rat just tends to neglect, right? They just go, I'm just going to go in and squat heavy today. I'm going to bench heavy today with absolutely no regard for those foundational movements. And, even things as simple as breathing mechanics, as walking mechanics. Like I preach this, to the nth degree. Like if you can't do these things well, don't do anything else. Just like focus on those first, because everything that stacks on top of those is dysfunctional.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does come down to the foundation. And I think the problem is, you grow up in fitness and you open magazines, you go on online forums. It's about sets. It's about how much weight you can lift, so how many pounds you can squat, so what's your bench. That's kind of how we pride ourselves in the fitness world. Like that's our badge of honor. Is like, I can squat 500 pounds. You might look like shit doing it, but you still throw up that number and you put a picture on Instagram of you squatting 500 pounds. So I think we've just kind of, it lends itself to, the look at me approach, to see yourself squatting as much as you can or lifting as much as you can. But, the problem is if you are lifting that weight with poor mechanics, you end up like a lot of the old powerlifters, which, I respect their work ethic, but a lot of the powerlifters, you see them these days, like they can barely move. I mean, they're just broken, beat to shit, all those guys, and maybe they were willing to pay that price. That's their own decision. But I think your average person going to the gym doesn't really want to pay that price. They do actually want to feel better. They do want to live longer. They want to be healthier. But the way that they're approaching their training is not necessarily supporting that, because they're building on a foundation of really heavy, poor movement and really high intensity, poor conditioning. Same thing.
Yeah, I know this isn't really the focus of today's chat, but I'm curious about maybe your maybe weighting of, is it just like minimum effective dose to make sure they're having the proper movement patterns? Is that how you weigh like how much to do? Because I'm sure the audience is like, well, how do I balance, the acquisition of the skill and output? And I'm curious.
Yeah, it is. It's two things. I would say it's minimum effective dose. It's retargeting your framing to do as much as I can with good movement versus just as much as I can. And so a lot of times as you're coaching, I think that's the other thing about coaching, I would say, is coaching has been very ingrained to push intensity, push effort, right? Like if I see somebody starting to get tired, most coaches' natural reaction will be like, all right, come on, keep going, let's go. So they revert to this motivation tactic of just do more. And that's kind of how they're driving their clients to think, like, just do more. The answer is do more. I'm supposed to do more. It's a very natural part of coaching, but not to say that, motivation at that level doesn't matter. It does. But I've always focusing on the technique angle of things as people fatigue. Focus on keep your posture where it needs to be, keep your breathing mechanics where they need to be. Coaching, as people get tired, it's not just do more, it's do better, right? It's move better as you get tired. That's been a big part of how I approached combat athlete sports over the years. Is you see people in combat sports get tired and then they swing to the fences and they gas out even more and they get knocked out or they get choked out or whatever. The reality is, when you're tired, the worst thing you can possibly do is let your technique go to hell and just swing to the fences, because that's when you're most likely to lose. So we just have to rethink, I think, coaching and what our goal is. And in a session, it's not that intensity doesn't matter or those things don't, because they matter. But if they're coming at the expense of your technique and they're coming at the expense of stressing your body way beyond its limits, then it's not more beneficial, it's less beneficial. So we just need to think the goal is to move as much as we can with good movement technique. As soon as we start to lose that, as soon as your technique starts to completely fall apart, as soon as you feel yourself not being able to move well, cut the set short. Use your heart rate. As soon as your heart rate's taking 5 minutes to come back down, you're probably gassed. You probably don't need to do the extra set or the extra high intensity part. You can use heart rate too as a guide of how much stress your body's under. Heart rate recovery is a really good measure of that. Maybe not necessarily as much for strength exercises, but for conditioning type exercises. If you see heart rate coming down relatively quickly, your body's recovering well and you're not placing yourself under too much stress. But when we start seeing the heart rate taking 2, 3, 4 minutes to recover, it's a sign that you're putting your body under stress. And if you keep doing that, your recovery is just going to continue to slow down. So there's a subjective measures of looking at people's recovery and movement and making sure they're where they should be, and then you can use some objective measures like heart rate to help reinforce that as well.
This is one of the things that I loved about your course, 8 weeks out. You almost delineated between learning a skill when you're fresh and then learning a skill when you're fatigued as two separate things. And I thought that was brilliant. It's like, yeah, doing something when you're fresh is one thing, but once you start to reach that level of fatigue, you have to almost like lock in deeper and deeper as far as like your ability to maintain that skill. And once you can't, the set's over.
Exactly. I mean, like everyone knows there's a difference between a bodyweight squat and a 500-pound squat. Those are very different things, right? Yeah. And we can look at that as just a spectrum of how the body is solving different movement tasks. To squat with no load is reasonably straightforward. To squat with 500 pounds, there's just a whole lot more that comes into play because there's more force involved. And it's the same thing with fatigue. To do a movement non-fatigued or to do a skill when you're not fatigued is one thing, but as you fatigue, you basically what you're doing is you're dropping out motor units, right? I mean, that's what fatigue is. It means less muscle is able to contract because that muscle is not firing anymore. And so that skill becomes different because that skill becomes something I'm trying to achieve with less muscle available to me and less respiratory capacity available to me, less oxygen available to me. So the skill, it's not an entirely different skill per se, but it's a different execution of that skill. It's a different environment to do that skill in. And if you look at like military people, if you can sit there and shoot a target all day long, you can hit the bullseye, great. But can you go ruck up a mountain with a big sack on your back and then hit the target in the middle of that? I mean, those are different things. Just because you can fire the gun when you're fresh doesn't mean you can fire the gun at a moving target or when someone's shooting back at you, right? I can hit a bag all day long, but can I hit a person as they're swinging at me? Like there's just different execution levels of skills, and fatigue is a very important variable that changes our skill. And if our goal is to get better in those fatigue states and those stress states, we have to train that skill in that state. And again, I think that's where coaching breaks down a lot of times is rather than using fatigue as a chance to coach to help someone get better, we just use fatigue as a chance to make somebody work harder because we think that's the goal. The goal is not really just work as hard as you can. It should be to develop and refine your movement and your skills, particularly if you're an athlete, to make sure you can still accomplish the goal even as you get tired versus, just go harder as you get tired. Those are two different goals.
Yeah. So shifting to nutrition a little bit, and this is a question I've been meaning to ask you for a long time. If we're training in any particular variable way, we have, multiple systems that get taxed when we're training. The nervous system's getting taxed, the muscular system's getting taxed, the energy systems are getting taxed. And I'm curious how you approach different training modalities with nutrition interventions, meaning if I'm doing something that's very neurologically taxing, as compared to something that's very muscular taxing, as compared to something that's very energetically taxing, do those require different nutritional interventions from your experience?
Yeah, look, something that's more metabolically taxing. Let's say I do a 90-minute or 2-hour thing. The stress is glycogen depletion. The stress is hydration. The stress is electrolyte balance. So there's more stress in different metabolic areas that you want to make sure nutritionally get met. So you want to make sure your glycogen gets refilled before the next session. You want to make sure your electrolytes get balanced correctly. You want to make sure hydration doesn't become a problem, versus a very heavy set of, squats where you might do 10 heavy squats in an hour. Some powerlifters doing that. That's a very different thing. Neurologically, you're depleting the neurotransmitters. You're depleting some of the hormones rapidly. So you're basically just depleting things different in the body based on that type of stress. And so, yeah, obviously calories always matter, but what am I depleting? That's the biggest question. And a powerlifter is not really depleting glycogen in a series of 1 rep maxes. They're depleting their CNS. Right. And so it's using nutrition to help replenish that and make sure they're not depleted a bunch of neurotransmitters versus, an endurance athlete that's spending 2 hours in a pretty depleted state, running consistently. So you just take that approach of what am I depleting? Like what is being hit the hardest here? What needs to be replenished, or what do I need to minimize from being replenished? And then, you'll take a different nutritional approach based on what those things are.
So if someone's neurologically taxing their body, what type of intervention would you be looking at? Is it like amino acids to make sure they have the substrate to build those neurotransmitters?
Yeah, amino acids for sure. Choline becomes a really big one. There's some of the new topics we've talked about that can really help with powerlifters or just, anything that's super neurologically demanding. Mm-hmm. It's making sure that the brain essentially has the nutrition it needs versus the muscular system, which is going to have, and the metabolic system, which will have a bigger need of, like I said, electrolytes and some of the B vitamins and all those things involved in energy production. But yeah, neurotransmitter, choline, there's all sorts of brain supplements, I've talked about before that you can use to facilitate that. They make a big difference. And then you kind of go up that ladder. There's varying degrees of, nootropics you can play in there. So I'd say try it all, but choline is one of those ones, and essential amino acids and different types of cocktails there are probably the best place to start.
Cool. Any considerations around central fatigue versus peripheral fatigue?
Look, I'm not saying that's an overrated topic. It matters, but you're going to always have fatigue on both. And it kind of comes back to central fatigue is more neuromuscular, neural, and peripheral fatigue is more metabolic just naturally. So there's not, I would say it just comes back to the angle of things of CNS versus muscular endurance type things. And you just play up like we just talked about. I don't know that there's massive differences from just the CNS versus the metabolic load.
Right. So if you see someone who's, putting in the hours, they're putting in the training, the movement quality's there, they've gone through a phase of establishing, great movement quality, but you're starting to see their recoverability and HRV trending down. what is a typical like order of operations as far as intervention? Does it have to be individualized person to person based on what you think the limitations are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to look at the lifestyle factors first. So you know the biggest thing is, as coaches or as people, you know what your training is, you know what it looks like, but you have to solve the question of, are they sleeping? Sleep is the number one thing, I would say. The thing you have to make sure that's dialed in first. I don't care what your training is. If your sleep is not there, that's the first thing you have to fix, because it'll be the limiting factor. Why? Because when you are sleeping, you're the most anabolic. It's that simple. I mean, that's what sleep is largely, is repair, recovery, regeneration. So you have to build your recovery on a foundation of sleep. So I always start with that, and then I'll go to diet. Not that diet's, you can say they're both equally important to some extent, because diet's also the other big limiting factor. And then you go to mental stress. What are their mental stress levels? How much of the stress are they under? Do they know how to deal with mental stress? Do they have a strategy in place? Are they good at it? Those sorts of things. And then you kind of come back full circle to the training, and you figure out what those other areas can support as far as training. So if their HRV is going down, is it just their training is increasing at the level that their recovery can't keep up with? And if so, what are the things that I can improve? We talked about earlier, what can I improve the easiest to have the biggest impact? So it's minimum effective dose, or I call it like the cost benefit. Like, what's something easy I can improve that's going to have the most benefit? Like, don't take the path of greatest resistance, take the path of least resistance. Like, if your sleep is the problem and your room is bright, like, put some shades up, put some blackout blinds, like, put some curtains on. Like, that'll cost you $50 and ship to Home Depot, and it can have a noticeable impact on your sleep. That's not a super difficult intervention to make. There's a lot of little things like that you can look for as people's HRV or the recovery starts to slide. Like, what's the cause, and what are the easiest ways to make a big impact quickly?
Very cool. I think a lot of people are looking for nutritional interventions to expedite recovery. And first, I'd like to have you talk about how much, and we kind of mentioned it, but how much of a role do you think calories play? So obviously, it's a huge window, I guess. If someone's at a huge caloric deficit, it's going to play a huge role. If someone's eating somewhere in around, their basal metabolic rate or their total daily expenditure, increasing the calories by 10% versus increasing them by 20% versus 30%. Do you have a kind of strategy you usually take to, approach recoverability?
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing. I look at the other areas, like, what are the areas that might be holding them back? So calories, as you mentioned, is the first thing. If you're not getting enough calories, you're in a deficit, and that means your body has to pull energy from its own stores, which is, it's going to slow down recovery. There's just no way around that. So you have to look at overall caloric expenditure or overall caloric intake first. You have to look at food quality, where are those calories actually coming from. You have to look at nutrient timing, where are their calories being distributed throughout the day, and what are insulin sensitivities and all those sorts of things. And you kind of just pick those things off. Like, are they getting enough calories? Yes. Okay, good. What is their overall food quality like? Are you eating quality foods or eating shitty foods? Okay, if they're eating shitty foods, let's fix that. Okay, they're great. They're eating good foods. What's their nutrient timing look like? And you just kind of go down this step-by-step process of the most important things, and you start dialing back. Like, a lot of times it's something obvious, like the biggest thing I'll tell you is stimulants. That's probably the one area I see people make the biggest mistake with, is they live on caffeine, they live on coffee, they live on Red Bull, they live on something that is a sympathetically driven stimulant, and that's going to slow down your recovery, because you're taking energy into the sympathetic, or you're creating energy sympathetically, and you're not recovering parasympathetically and putting energy back in. So I just kind of go down this laundry list of calories, food quality, stimulants, supplements, those sorts of things. And again, see what I can find that may be an obvious thing to improve. And it's just a matter of process of elimination. And then I think you can really go, if you start to see all those things look good and they're still not recovering, that's where you can go down the blood test route. I think that's where you can get in metabolic panels, you can get in nutrient panels, you can, either find a doctor, a naturopath, or somebody who's progressive, and you can really start to dig into hormone levels and, again, nutrient status and immune markers. And you can really kind of go down that rabbit hole of finding the things that metabolically that are keeping you from recovering, and you can spend the time and the money to invest in that. But my experience tells me a lot of people have easier places to start than to get there. There's definitely something that's been ongoing, you haven't been able to solve, you feel like your diet's where it should be, you feel like you're doing the right thing, you're training the right way, and you're still not recovering. That's when I think you want to go down some of these deeper rabbit holes of getting these panels done and figuring out the solution there, because you can sometimes pinpoint something that you didn't know. Maybe you're eating something you were sensitive to. Maybe you have some deficiency in some B vitamins or some sort of absorption. Like, you can find all these things with these panels and you dig into it. But a lot of times people can just figure it out much easier by kind of walking themselves the how many calories am I getting? What's my food quality? What does my nutrient timing look like? All those sorts of things can usually paint the picture first. And then, if you have to go further down the rabbit hole, you want to, you can.
Got it. Talk to me about food quality, Joel. You mentioned, how much quality matters. I'm curious how you kind of define that.
And just where the food's coming from, right? Like, what are the sources of it? And I think we all know that, healthy, homegrown fruits and vegetables can be better than stuff you're going to buy in the store. I mean, there's no question if you have any sort of food sourcing of where your food's actually coming from, that's valuable. What are the other ingredients put in there? Is it highly processed? I mean, you can kind of just use a general thumb. If it comes out of a can with a lot of preservatives and a lot of chemicals you can't pronounce, it's probably lower food quality than if it's a whole food coming from the source.
The reason I asked that is because there's this huge camp, as you know, of like macros. It's like the only thing that matters is macros. Hit your macros. So I want to know what you define as, things that you maybe should avoid. Do you have a list of things you should do, or do you have like a framework of like, hey, here's how you make decisions? So rather than giving people like, hey, eat this, don't eat that, I like to give people principles. I'm like, hey, this is what I believe should guide your decision-making process. So it sounds like, natural, whole foods, I don't know if you have like a list of things you go through.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's, like I said, it's fairly simple. If you can't read the label and you can't understand what's on the label, you probably shouldn't be eating it for the most part. So I just spent, like we talked about, a couple months in Hawaii, and you have very, very good food out there because it comes literally from the farms on Hawaii. I wasn't eating, you just aren't eating stuff out of a box. You are eating stuff out of a can. You are eating stuff that's processed a million times over before you get to. I think we all, generally speaking, know what's relatively good quality food and what's generally not. Our problem is the less quality food is usually more convenient food, right? It's easier to get, it's cheaper. I can walk into the store and buy something versus having to go to a farmer's market or go to a place where I could get it from the farm directly. Those sorts of things are more difficult and they're more expensive. I mean, it's unfortunately it costs more money to eat good quality food than it costs to eat cheap, shitty processed food.
Yep.
And so you can just pass the little test of where does this come from and how many times has it been processed before I put it in my mouth. And if it's coming out of a can with a million preservatives and things you can't read, it's definitely not as healthy for you as coming from the farm.
Right. So what negative effects have you seen from people eating poor quality foods?
Look, you see their HRV tank dramatically. Yeah. You see a much different profile. It's the same thing with movement. Somebody who moves really well, you see them recover faster. You see their HRV more resilient. It's the same thing with food. If somebody's eating good quality foods and they're getting them, from a farm or a farmer's market, or growing them themselves. Like my girlfriend's family's got chickens. We eat other farm fresh eggs, and you can get meat from the cows and the butchers directly. Like if you find people that eat that way, you see a big difference in their recovery and their overall resilience, just because I think it's just the body processes those things a whole lot easier. It's designed to process those things a whole lot easier. And when you see people make the transition, sometimes it's night and day. You'll find somebody who is always under recovered, always had poor cholesterol numbers, always struggled with weight loss, and then boom, it's like a switch just was flipped, and all of a sudden their weight comes off easier, they feel better, their sleep improves. All those things can change just from making some choices that are, maybe it's the same number of calories, but you're getting farm fresh eggs versus, egg concentrate in a carton out of the store. I mean, it sounds like it's the same food, but the quality can be tremendously different.
Yeah. Talk to me about tissue quality. I know you work with a ton of high level athletes. And so what I've seen kind of anecdotally is you have people who just seem to maintain great fluid movement. They maintain great mobility. And they can sustain that even at high levels of performance. And then you have other people who it almost seems like the tissues start to become brittle. They start to become tight. They become immobile. What are your kind of maybe go-tos or interventions for, checking boxes to make sure you sustain high tissue quality over time?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is, depending if we're talking about athletes, actually talking about anybody, I think getting some sort of soft tissue treatment going is important. I think it's an important part of maintaining your health. So, if you don't have pro athletes budget, which most of us don't, there's all sorts of self myofascial release and self massage tools available to you these days. So I use AccuMobility balls. Those are really great tools, like things like the Theragun, and all these little tools are popping up. Like using those things is valuable, and using them on a consistent basis is valuable. If you're constantly in pain from something, like there's something wrong, like you need to address those things before they become chronic, nagging injuries, become, chronic surgery things that you need. So it's just a matter of taking care of yourself. And it comes back to all the things we've talked about: people who sleep better, people who eat better, people who manage their overall stress loads better. Their soft tissue quality stays a lot higher, because a lot of times the soft tissue quality suffers is because it is an abundance of stress, too much. So think about this: if we put the tissue under a bunch of load and then we don't recover well from it, it's essentially putting that tissue in compromised position. It's making it more susceptible to stress of load, and making it more susceptible to breaking down, and more susceptible to injury over time. So if we take care of all the other things and we focus on addressing the soft tissue problems, and we do incorporate soft tissue therapies in, in our own houses, our own training, like everything works together really well. It's the person who's not sleeping very well, they're stressed out of their mind, they're overtraining, they're doing too much high intensity, they're drinking lots of stimulants, their soft tissue quality suffers tremendously. So it's a byproduct, in my experience, of all these other things put together that lead down that path. Because it's you stress tissue, if you give it a chance to recover, the quality stays high. If you stress tissue over and over again, you don't get a chance to recover, it starts to develop scar tissue. It starts to develop poor movement qualities, which then exacerbate other areas that weren't designed for. So it's just kind of the end result of everything you're doing that dictates a lot of that stuff. And you have to be mindful of all of it if you really want to maintain good soft tissue quality. And to me, it's why you see the difference in people staying healthy versus people who are chronically injured. Like if you take someone who's chronically injured, has bad soft tissue quality, chances are they have bad movement. Chances are they're living on stimulants. Chances are their HRV is low. Chances are they don't do much conditioning. Chances are, like, all those things you see underlying the surface of people who are chronically injured and have bad soft tissue are just the result of everything else.
How much value do you place on breathing and respiration rate as far as its implication in recovery?
A ton. I mean, breathing plays a ton of role into how we move, into how we recover, all of that. So, I mean, I've worked a lot with Mike Robertson and Bill Hartman. I know you've worked with some other guys as well. I think they're great stuff. And there's multiple ways to get there, but the bottom line is how you breathe affects everything, because it's oxygen transport, it's mobility, it's all these things combined. So, if you're not doing anything whatsoever for breathing, I think you're missing a big piece of that, which is why I had Mike and Bill come in my course, and Brian McKenzie. There's lots and lots of guys out there that are starting to make this stuff more, at least making people more aware of it and giving people tools. So I would say it's hugely important. Same thing, like people who move well tend to breathe well. People who breathe well tend to move well. Like you see these correlations because they're all related to one another. If you move terrible, chances are your breathing's not very good, and chances are your sleep's not very good. So it's just this, my experience, it's a big chain reaction, and it's putting all these things together. And again, coming back to what we talked about of what's the missing link. Well, if my movement is a big problem for me, part of how I'm going to have to address that is going to have to be through breathing, because probably that's part of the cause, and I'm going to have to figure out how to improve that to get my movement to where it needs to be. So it's just all connected together, and just figuring out what is I need to improve and what are the pieces of that I need to personally improve to get there.
Yeah, awesome. I think breathing is the number one intervention behind sleep as far as improving people's perception to stress, right? If I can get you to decrease your heart rate, decrease your respiration rate, typically your perceived stress goes down, your parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick on, allow you to have better digestion, better oxygen delivery, all these things that just directly correlate with performance.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, it's because fundamentally breathing is tied to both movement and the parasympathetic nervous system. So if I can tap into my parasympathetic nervous system, I'm inherently turning down that sympathetic nervous system, which is what we want to do. We don't want to be sympathetic all day. We don't want to be in constantly a state of stress all day. And the easiest way to break that is improving your breathing and being able to have that mental skill of relaxation. So, relaxation is within. I say that the environment can change. If you can learn the skill to turn that sympathetic system off, no matter how much stress you're under, you can develop, a whole lot healthier lifestyle, because life is stressful. It's how you react to it that matters. Think about that. I mean, to me, that's a powerful thing. I mean, you're never going to get away from stress, but you can change the way that you react to it.
And make your body more resilient.
Yeah, you can make your body more resilient. And that resiliency leads to greater lifespan. I mean, it really is that simple. I mean, lifespan comes back to how well your body deals with stress over the course of your life. And if it deals with stress poorly and it's under a lot of stress, you're going to die early. You're going to have cardiovascular disease. You're going to have stroke. You're going to have diabetes. You're going to have all these things that we see kill so many people. But if you can make yourself more resilient by developing that stress tolerance skill and by developing the physical tools around fitness, you're going to be a whole lot likely to live longer. It's that simple.
This is a subjective thing, because I don't think there's any data on it, but I'm curious your opinion. So if I have someone who's trying to push calories up, they're like, yeah, I want to recover more, I want to build muscle more. Giving your thought around maybe interventions as far as, should the first line of attack be like, hey, I want to actually stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system to allow your body to extrapolate more nutrients from this food versus just hammering more food in, right? So if I'm giving so I've got an athlete who's got, typically eating 3,000 calories a day, he's not recovering. So I bumped him 3,500, he's not recovering, I bumped him to 4,000. There's certainly some window of like, okay, we don't want to push calories anymore. We want to then maybe shift to like, we want to absorb and assimilate more.
Yep.
So therefore maybe a parasympathetic intervention or two to allow your body to actually extrapolate more nutrients from the food. I was curious if you had any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think, well, you just got to realize taking in energy is energy extensive, right? Or energy intensive, and digestion is energy intensive. So just adding blanket calories in isn't always a direct path to recovery, because digestion is hard on your body. It takes work to digest food. So, if you are calorically, I think probably the reason where that might help is if you're taking in shittier foods, maybe more nutrients is required to get the recovery you need. But in general, I would prefer to use a parasympathetic, based intervention and figure out why they can't turn the sympathetic system off, than just feed more and more and more calories. And that's not to say maybe they do need more calories. They certainly might. But I think generally speaking, there's other areas you would tackle first. And if maybe those weren't working, then you look at their calories and then you can bump them up. It wouldn't be my first go-to for recovery. Wouldn't be like just slam 500 more calories than somebody. There's usually easier ways to go about it.
So how would you make that decision? So what did you base it on HRV? Would you base it on subjective variables? Like, how do you know which lever to pull?
Look at their data and talk to them. I mean, kind of just coach, right? I mean, okay, let's look at these different areas and see what you're doing now and see which one we think is the limiting factor. And then you make a change and see, did it work? I mean, that's what it comes down to. How do you feel? What's improving, what's not improving? It's just a process of trial and error and educated guessing and making the right decisions based on your coaching experience. And then I think you have to have a way to test it. Like, here's what I think is your problem. Let's try this and see what happens. Give it a chance to work. Did it work? Yes. Great. Keep doing it. Did it work? No. Okay. Well, let's think about this again. So it's always just, it comes down to, you really have two approaches. Like you said, it's throw shit at the wall and hope it sticks, or it's like make a targeted guess based on data and based on talking to somebody and making using your coaching knowledge, and then saying, let's see what happens. Let's try it for 7 days or 10 days or 30 days. Let's look at your HRV. Is it improving? Like, how you feel? Are your numbers, are numbers getting better? Are you sleeping? Is your sleep improving? Is your recovery improving? Like, did it work? And if the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, then take a second stab at it. Versus let's just try everything at once. That's the other thing I think people do too much. It's like the guys who take 10 different anabolics at once. Like, you have no idea what's what. So you have to just try one thing at a time and see if it works, versus trying 10 things, because you don't have any idea which of those 10 things. If I'm going to do cryo and then I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. Like, you can't do 10 different things in recovery and have any idea which one of them was actually beneficial.
Yeah.
So, I think over time, you really want to learn your own body. What does your body respond well to? What type of foods do you absorb really well? What type of food should you avoid? What type of training strategies work really well for you? What type of recovery strategies work well for you? Those are things that every person needs to learn for themselves. And as a coach, you can help them guide that path. But ultimately, everyone is different. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Some things may work great for me and terrible for you. I can't just assume that because it worked great for me, it works for you. And so I think you do have to learn that path. You have to learn those answers on your own.
One thing I tend to use is just like, are you hungry? And if someone tends to be not hungry, I usually assume that, okay, you're probably getting enough food. It's probably something else that's interfering with your ability to recover. And if like, hey, if there's any time of the day where you're hungry, okay, that means you're probably digesting, absorbing, and assimilating most of the food you got. We probably have some room there to push it up a little bit. That's kind of a simple approach that I've taken. It seems to be relatively effective.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Thoughts on one last question. I know we got to go. Two questions, but the first one, thoughts on cold and heat as far as interventions for recovery.
They can be really powerful, or they can be detrimental. It comes down to the dose, particularly the cold. So cold is obviously anti-inflammatory, which can be a good thing if you have chronic inflammation. But there's also research out there, like if you train and you go to cold bath every day, you're negating some of the benefit because you want to stimulate some of the inflammation from training, because that's part of the stimulus for the body to improve. So I've seen people take it too far the other direction and just like always be trying to use cold to shut off inflammation. But again, you're going to negate some of the benefits of that training. So I think in the right doses, the right times, it can be really effective. If you're in a training camp or you're in season, or you're just, you're always stressed from life and you want to get your workouts in, you can't figure out how to, manage recovery. Like, you can throw some of those things in there, but again, it's got to be a measured, precise, prescriptive thing, versus like, oh, I'm just gonna go in a cold tub every day for 20 minutes. Like, sooner or later, that's probably going to do more harm than good, and it's probably not the right approach. And the same thing with heat. Heat can have a really good stimulating circulatory effect. Lots of research shows it can stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. But if you're living in the hot tub every single day, it'll A, lose its effectiveness, and B, probably not really be the best strategy. So those things, in the right doses, the right times, I think both can be used effectively. It's just a matter of when and how much, and that's again kind of comes down to your own physiology and using HRV or using something to gauge that. If you do a cold plunge, the next day your HRV tanked, you probably did too much of it. There's actually a cool study somebody did with cold water immersion, where they used HRV using the Bioforce system as a gauge for how much and how long they should do it. and they called like customized cold water versus like generic cold water or something like that. And the customized cold water got better results, noticeably better results, significantly better. So it's just, they prescribed how much cold therapy to do based on their HRV and then measure the change. So it's pretty cool to see that, recovery is like training. It's personalized. You want to use your own body to figure that out.
So final question before I know you got to bounce off. Tell us about Morpheus. You gave me a good 20, 30-minute demo prior to our call. It looks absolutely incredible. What is it? Where can people find it? And tell us about it.
Yeah, so really Morpheus is the first tool for coaches that helps them connect all the dots of lifestyle and training together in a really meaningful and valuable way. So we pull data in from all sorts of different wearables, from Fitbits to Apple Watches and Oura Rings and Polar, and any sort of wearable data device people are out there. We will pull that in along with our own Morpheus device to give people recovery, HRV, training, sleep, activity, all these different things. And then we'll help coaches basically make better decisions or help their clients make better decisions by giving them heart rate recovery zones, by showing them how their training's affecting them, all these different pieces. And then we're building communication tools so you can chat, communicate. Really, it's coaching 2.0 in my mind. It's helping coaches realize that session reps and rest intervals is just one piece of coaching. It's always other things we've talked about that matter most. The problem has been for most coaches, as soon as you leave the gym, you're a giant black box to me. I don't know how much you're sleeping. I don't know what you're doing for food quality. I don't know how much mental stress you're under. I don't know what you're doing. I'm just kind of in the dark, and you come back in the next session and I train you again. And so I'm really just flying blind. I'm just kind of hoping that you took care of it, and chances are you didn't, is the reality of it. So I think it adds a whole new layer, or will add a whole new layer to coaching, and it'll open up a lot of people's eyes into seeing that fitness is more than just the workout. Fitness is everything in between the workout as well. If you're neglecting that piece, you're just leaving results on the table, and you're leaving people to fend for themselves. So really excited about it. Like I said, it's coming out in June. They'll be able to find more at trainwithmorpheus.com as we get closer. I think it's going to make a huge impact in the industry. I think the coaches, clients, gyms are just really going to see tremendous value from having access to this data, not just numbers on a page, but to me, we're turning data into fitness by using that data to tell a story. And that's what it comes down to. Data tells a story of someone's life, and they tell the story of someone's fitness. And Morpheus, to me, is the first tool that's made that story easy to understand and easier to improve versus just a bunch of numbers on a screen.
I saw it. It looks absolutely phenomenal. I can't wait to get into the group and try it out myself and get all my coaching clients on it, Joel. And Recover to Win is out now, right? People can jump in there.
Just go to 8weeksout.com, jump in courses, Recover to Win. They can sign up for it. It's a couple $100, 7 hours of content. They get CEUs of their coaches, walking down each of the steps we talked about. And so far, the feedback has been awesome, and people are starting to dig into it. I love hearing great feedback and success stories. When people start using the stuff you put out there and they beat right back to you and tell you the results they've seen, there's nothing better. So
you've been doing this. Yeah, you've been doing this a long time. You do it better than most. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom, buddy.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. Good talking to you once again.
Absolutely. That's a wrap, ladies and gents, boys and girls. Thank you very much for joining me here on the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. The podcast world continues to grow and thrive, and there's so much competition out there. And I'm so grateful for your loyalty, for you listening to the podcast. And ultimately, I don't take that lightly. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Joel Jamieson for providing so much information and so much wealth and experience. There's incredible amounts of value in everything he has to say. So if you didn't get it all in, I highly suggest you go back and listen to it all over again, take notes, and ultimately apply this information so you can thrive and share with at least one person you know who is trying to build a lean, healthy, and muscular body, perform at the highest level, and ultimately live their greatest life in a body they love. Thank you very much to Belcampo and Ancestral Supplements for sponsoring this podcast. Belcampo.com/muscle will get you 20% off. Head over and support them and try all of their products, guys. They're going to love everything. There's literally not a single thing on that website that I don't love. And thank you to ancestralsupplements.com for being here and supporting this podcast. ancestralsupplements.com/Ben, or use the code Ben to get 10% off. And again, as I highly suggest that everyone, including adults and children, should be taking some amount of organ meats every day. I take 6 capsules of liver, sometimes kidney, and sometimes their blend, literally with every meal that I'm consuming. So I hope you guys head over and take advantage of these amazing deals. And thank you for being here once again. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, go do that now on your favorite podcast provider. Thank you guys for being here. Much love, and I will see you again next time.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Muscle Intelligence. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with at least one person you know. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.